morning had settled in without a sound. Ray was already awake. She no longer knew for how long. Her sleep had not been steady these past few days. It came, withdrew, and frayed without warning, and she remained there, suspended between two states, never truly surrendering to either. That morning, she lay in bed, her gaze turned toward the window. The glass cut the world into silence. Beyond it, the morning light held that almost deceptive softness, the kind that made everything seem simple, as though nothing had changed, as though life still moved according to a rhythm she might somehow belong to. She watched the figures below, passers-by, a few irregular movements, trajectories that had nothing to do with her. The people she was looking at did not know, and they could not know. Her fingers rested on the sheet, calm, inert, at least in appearance. But inside her, something was at work, a thought refusing to stay where it belonged.
Go out.
An obvious thing that returned again and again until it became impossible to ignore.
Go out.
Not into the corridors, not into this controlled, measured, anticipated space. She wanted something else. A sigh left her, touched with frustration, something caught between lack, impatience, and a form of exhaustion, as though remaining here any longer was becoming too much. That was when a movement drew her attention. Alyssa had entered the room, discreet, straight-backed and attentive without being intrusive. Ray finally turned her eyes away from the window. She reached for the tablet with a gesture that did not hesitate. Her fingers moved lightly over the surface for a moment, just long enough for the thought to sharpen. She wrote,
I want to go out.
Then she lifted her eyes slightly toward Alyssa. Alyssa read it, and her expression did not change immediately, but something in her posture adjusted. She became more attentive, more cautious.
Of course, my lady.
Her voice remained soft, composed, faithful to what it had been from the beginning.
Would you like us to go to the gardens?
The answer was logical, predictable, safe. Ray lowered her gaze briefly to the tablet. She already knew the gardens by heart, their laid-out paths, those carefully designed spaces meant to soothe. That freedom, contained and arranged, had begun to weary her. It was not what she wanted. Her fingers returned to the tablet. This time, the movement was quicker, more direct.
No.
Then,
I want to go into the city.
the silence that followed lasted no more than a second, but it was dense. Alyssa did not answer right away, not out of refusal, but because the request was not a usual one.
The city.
She repeated the word softly, as though weighing it. Her gaze shifted back to Ray.
That will require a few preparations, my lady.
Ray held her gaze. Alyssa inclined her head slightly.
I will inquire immediately.
She straightened with that same quiet precision and left Ray alone. The room recovered its calm. Alyssa was not gone for long. Ray had not moved her gaze from the window. But even before Alyssa spoke, she knew something had been decided.
My lady.
The voice was the same, soft, composed, and perfectly in place.
Permission has been granted. We can arrange a trip into the city.
The words were simple, but what they carried was not. Ray did not move at once, and yet, with that one confirmation, something that had until now been only impulse became real. Alyssa continued without haste.
Security will remain at a distance, so as not to obstruct your movements.
Her eyes briefly dropped to the chair.
It is, however, recommended that you remain seated for the duration of the outing.
It was not an order, but neither was it truly an option.
The route will be limited, in order to avoid excessive fatigue.
Each condition was added calmly, without pressure, without any visible rigidity. And yet, the framework was there, clear and invisible, but solid. Ray felt her fingers tighten slightly on the armrest. She could go out, yes, but not freely. She knew that perfectly well. And still, she did not retreat. She slowly turned away from the window just enough to meet Alyssa's eyes. There was neither refusal nor frustration in her expression, but something more subtle, a lucid acceptance. She knew what she was being granted and what was being taken from her at the same time. Her fingers moved over the tablet.
It's enough.
Alyssa inclined her head.
Very well, my lady.
And in that simple exchange, something settled into place. Ray did not control everything, but she had chosen. And for now, that was enough. The drive passed without incident. The vehicle moved with an almost unreal smoothness, cutting through the outside world without ever truly joining it. Through the tinted glass, the city appeared only in fragments, sliding past without insisting. Ray said nothing. She watched. When the car finally slowed, something shifted, not abruptly, but enough for her attention to tighten. The door opened. Air entered. It was different, less clean and controlled, but alive. The sounds did not form a coherent whole. On the contrary, they layered over one another. Voices, footsteps, and an engine too close. A burst of laughter that came without warning. A metallic sound she did not identify at once. Nothing was filtered, even less adjusted. And that was precisely what struck her. She was settled with care. The chair glided over the ground with measured softness, almost in contrast to the surrounding agitation. Alyssa remained slightly behind her, guiding the chair.
We can move on, my lady.
Ray did not answer, because her gaze had already gone elsewhere. She was not discovering. It was not curiosity. Not exactly. It was something else. A diffuse recognition not of places or faces, but of sensations. The uneven rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, light reflecting in a shop window, the discrete disorder of a street that made no attempt to be perfect. She knew this was not her city. And yet, something in that very imperfection answered something in her. Her gaze lingered on a narrower side street, set slightly back from the main flow. The light fell differently there, softer and more slanted. Her fingers tightened slightly because she knew that sensation. The alley itself was nothing remarkable, too narrow to draw attention and way too ordinary to be noticed. And yet Ray's gaze did not leave it. The light fell at an angle, cut by the uneven height of the buildings. It did not fill the space. It only passed through it, leaving denser patches of shadow, almost motionless. A sound slipped into it, light, sharp, the discreet strike of a sole against a stone step. Her fingers stilled on the armrest. Her gaze sharpened. She looked at the stone, the steps, even the shadow. Ray's breath suspended itself slightly. She had been there before, not in this place, but elsewhere. The shift did not come brutally. The alley slowly dissolved and made room for something else. The stone was older there, more uneven, worn by time and by repeated passage. Ray was younger, climbing the steps two at a time. Her breathing was quick, but she did not slow down.
You're going to end up falling.
She lifted her eyes without surprise.
I'm used to it.
The voice came from behind her, calm, steady, faintly amused.
That doesn't make it a good reason.
Ray turned halfway, already in motion. A brief smile, almost insolent, passed over her face.
Then watch closely.
And she resumed climbing. The temple where she had grown up appeared as she rose. It was a place of rules, silence, restraint. But she was not always meant for her place there. Her steps finally slowed when she reached the upper landing. She placed a hand against the wall, catching her breath without really stopping. Then, with a quick gesture that seemed almost habitual, she glanced behind her. No one. A more open smile pulled at her lips. Because she was not supposed to go out that day, not alone, and certainly not like that. And yet, she slipped through the side entrance, moving beyond the supervised spaces with an ease that did not belong to a first attempt. The air was different below, freer, less burdened. This time she went down more slowly, almost savoring each step. There was always something to see outside, something they did not give her inside, and she wanted to see it again. The piano was out of tune in the lower register. She had noticed it the first time, and ever since, it was all she could hear.
You listen too much.
Ray looked up. She was sitting very straight but tense, her hands resting on her knees as though they were not yet allowed to exist.
It sounds wrong.
The woman across from her lifted one eyebrow slightly, not annoyed, not mocking.
And?
The word remained there, simple and unexpected. Ray frowned faintly.
It bothers me.
A brief silence followed, then a finger touched a key. The note rang out. Imperfect.
So does life.
Ray did not answer. Her shoulders stiffened even more.
Are you waiting for everything to be right before you begin to sing?
The remark did not strike like a blow. It settled.
I don't want to fail.
The answer came out faster than she would have liked. More naked, too. The woman's gaze softened. Only barely.
You will fail.
Ray lowered her eyes. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her trousers.
And then you'll begin again.
Silence. Longer this time, denser. Then,
Go on, sing.
Ray inhaled a little too quickly. The first sound she gave wavered, and she nearly stopped at once.
Continue.
The voice did not push her, but it did not leave her an escape either. Ray closed her eyes. 1 second, no more. Then she began again. This time her voice trembled too, but she did not stop. And then something happened, fragile, unstable, but real. The note held, a moment longer, then fell.
There.
Ray opened her eyes again.
That wasn't perfect,
A slight breath, almost a smile.
but it was alive.
Ray remained still. She did not yet understand completely, but something in her had just opened. The sound of the piano did not vanish entirely. It thinned out as though blending into something else. Voices, younger ones, more numerous.
Ray, you're late again.
She lifted her head, out of breath, as always. Her bag slipped on her shoulder as she barely slowed.
I said I was coming.
Yeah, but when you say I'm coming, it means 20 minutes from now.
A laugh burst out, then another. Ray rolled her eyes, but something in her expression had already softened.
You're unbearable.
And you're slow.
I'm not talking to you anymore.
You say that every day.
She finally stopped in front of them. They were a small group, disorderly and loud. They could not keep still. Some spoke over one another. Others were already tapping rhythms on their thighs or against the wall behind them. Someone was humming without really singing. Someone else was correcting him.
No, not like that.
Yes, it is. Listen.
No, you're off.
Ray dropped her bag to the ground, without waiting, without asking. She stepped into the noise as though it belonged to her.
You're all off.
Oh, so now she's here to judge?
Someone has to.
Go on then, show us.
After a brief silence, Ray inhaled, and her voice came out. Still imperfect, still fragile in places, but she did not stop. The looks changed, subtly, not admiring, not yet, but attentive.
That's better.
Yeah.
You've been working.
Ray looked away slightly, as though she refused to linger on it.
I just practiced.
Liar.
A faint smile passed. That was when he spoke.
Again.
The voice was not louder than the others, but it cut through them without effort. Ray turned her head and saw him. He was standing slightly apart, not isolated, but not at the center either. Akihito.
Again. From the beginning.
He gave her direction, and Ray held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest nod, and began again. They had never really decided to go there. It had simply become natural, a small shop on the corner, too narrow for the number of them and too noisy to be comfortable. And yet, they always came back.
What are we getting?
Nothing.
Oh, come on.
I don't have money.
As usual?
You don't either.
I do.
Ray set a few coins down on the table.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Madame Rich.
Shut up.
But she was smiling. They crowded around the table, elbows crossing, bags dropping to the floor without anyone caring. Someone grabbed a drink before it had even been properly set down. Another protested without any real conviction.
Hey, that was mine.
You should have taken it first.
You're impossible.
Are you coming tomorrow?
Ray lifted one shoulder slightly.
Maybe.
Don't lie.
I'm not lying.
You always come.
A brief silence. Then,
Yeah.
Akihito was there, not in the center, never, but present. He watched more than he spoke. And when he did speak,
You're still forcing the ending.
Ray turned toward him.
I did it the way you said.
Not exactly,
A pause.
but it was better.
That was all, and yet, it was enough. Ray lowered her eyes slightly. Not to hide, but to keep that for herself. The memory might have gone on and stretched even further, but something slipped into it. A sound, discreet at first, almost drowned by everything else. Then clearer, a melody. Ray did not recognize it immediately, not consciously, but her body, it froze. The noise of the street came back, at once, brutally. The chair, the pavement, the light, everything had returned to its place, but the music remained, not inside the memory, here, real. It was coming from a little farther away. A display window, or a half-open door. Ray did not move. Then, slowly, she turned her head. The opening notes repeated. And this time, there was no doubt. It was them. Not exactly, but enough. She recognized the structure of the melody, its progression, even its intentions. Her group's song was there, but something was missing, or had been changed. Her breathing caught the voice. It was not the same. It was not hers. The interpretation differed from the one she knew, because someone else was singing, over something that had belonged to them. Her fingers tightened on the armrest. The world around her continued, indifferent, and something inside her gave way. It was not violent, a slow, deep rupture, like a certainty cracking without sound. It was no longer theirs, it was no longer hers. And yet, she recognized every note. The melody moved forward as though nothing had changed, but something inside her slipped out of alignment. Her breath stopped like a forgotten thing. The air went in and did not come out properly. Her chest remained suspended, tense inside and uncomfortable in between. The voice continued, too clean and controlled. Where theirs had caught, trembled, and had lived, here everything was corrected. Her fingers tightened more. The joints whitened slightly from the pressure.
No.
The word did not pass through the tablet, nor through her lips, but it was there, clear. This was not it. The song kept going, imperturbable, and as it advanced, something else rose with it. It was not a memory, it was a more unstable, more troubled sensation, as though two versions were overlapping, hers and this one. The lines did not fall in the same places. The breaths were shifted, the silences shortened. They had filled in what, once upon a time, had been left suspended, and that, precisely, was what made her want to turn away. Another voice slipped through, lower, older, almost imperceptible.
That's not you.
Her eyelids closed for a fraction of a second, not long enough to disappear, just long enough to falter.
Do you hear it?
It was not an intrusion, more like something she already knew far too well. Ray opened her eyes again. The music was still playing, but she was no longer inside it. She was facing it now with a colder feeling settled inside her. Not anger, not yet. It was something sharper, an absence, as though, in this version of things, she had never existed at all. And her throat tightened, not to speak, but to contain the pain. Her gaze lingered 1 second too long on the source of the sound. Then, slowly, she looked away. Her fingers left the armrest and reached for the tablet. The movement was steady, steadier than it had been only moments earlier. She wrote, without pausing, without correcting herself.
Let's go back.
She did not lift her eyes immediately. There was no need. Alyssa had already read it.
Very well, my lady.
No questions or hesitation. The chair turned slightly, leaving the music behind them as it continued to play. Ray did not look back. The drive back felt shorter, or perhaps simply quieter. The city continued to exist around her, but she no longer looked at it the same way. The details that, only minutes earlier, had caught her attention slipped away without leaving any imprint on her mind. Her hands rested once more on her knees, calmer but not relaxed. Inside her, something remained taut, not agitation, not panic, rather a tension line, invisible but undeniably there. The vehicle slowed, then stopped. The doors opened. The air of the clinic returned, cleaner, more neutral, more controlled. Ray did not react immediately. Then, without waiting to be asked, she adjusted her posture slightly, as though putting herself back into place. The wheelchair crossed the threshold. The corridors returned, the silence too. Everything was back where it belonged, on the surface, because inside her, nothing truly was anymore. The music was no longer playing, and yet, it was still there.